Hello, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I see that a lot of you are logging in. So while you're doing that, I'm going to go ahead and do an introduction about the webinar that we're offering this morning. Microbial Insights is delighted to have a brilliant and experienced speaker with us. We have John Sohl. John's going to be talking about how to leverage high-resolution site characterization with the microbiology using these molecular tools along with the site characterization to help you really optimize remediation strategies, get more cost-effective outcomes on the site. So many of you know John. He's been in this industry for a long time, like me. So John is the co-founder of Columbia Technologies, and he brings to his role of president and CEO 3 decades of experience directing the development of innovative and business solutions that fuse science and technology. John is brilliant, and he works with partners North and South America and in Africa, and he really leads his company on global growth of sustainable environmental services. He's also the co-founder of the award-winning Smart Data Solutions real-time data services platform, and he's played an integral role in providing clients with real-time decision-making information. So we are thrilled to have John here with us today and so much experience. So during his presentation, if you can go into the software and enter any questions that you have for John, at the end of the presentation, he'll go through and we'll do a short question and answer session. So you can use your GoToWebinar software there and type those questions in as they come up. If you can reference the slide, if you have a particular question about the slide, that's really helpful to us at the end. And also please note that this webinar is being recorded, and it's going to be available in the resource section of the Microbial Insights website within the next week. So if you have any questions for John, as I mentioned, go ahead and enter those into the software, and we will automatically send you the link so that you can hear this webinar again. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, John.
Hey, thanks, Dora, and I'm thrilled to be here. And thanks to all of you for logging in and joining us today. We hope we have something that really helps demonstrate to you sort of the experience that Dora and I have picked up over the last several decades in the industry. And so we're going to, like you said, we're going to whip through these slides and introduce some technologies to you, and then we'll give you some applications of how the two go together and some thoughts that you might consider when you're considering those things. And so our objectives today is just to make sure we're all on the same level playing field, just to review quickly what the array of high resolution and microbiological tools are that are used in site characterization. A little bit of touch on how to leverage the large databases of high resolution data and that Dora has in the microbiological. I think between the two of us, we have probably the globe's largest databases in those two different areas. Then we're going to talk about how high resolution information can inform you on the cost-effective use of where you might consider any of the array of microbio tools, and then we'll answer your questions as we've mentioned. Contemplate this image. I know many of you have seen it. Some people call it the world's most famous image. I guess Mona Lisa and Da Vinci have a little objection to that. But this was taken by astronaut Bill Anders in 1968, and it's called the Earth Rising. And it really sort of changed a lot of what happened in this industry and in the conscience of the public, particularly in the United States. And in 1968, that started moving our efforts forward in the environmental industry. And some of us are old enough to remember that. And it really points out, if you take a look at our one globe that we all live on, you don't see any particular sites in this picture. You don't see borders, you don't see conflicts, you don't see political lines, but you do see an ecosystem that is our responsibility to take care of from an environmental, economic, and social perspective. We're all living on the planet together, and I just ask you to think about that as you consider each of the decisions that you take in the industry. And if you think about that, look at that globe, what you see there is a picture that's got chemical issues in it, or chemical perspectives to it, hydrological perspectives, geochemical, and microbiological. And that's really what we want to now sort of zoom in to an individual site and understand, well, how do we take a look at those aspects of our site and create an environment that is successful in cleaning itself up. And we know Mother Earth can do that if we give her a chance. We also want to take a look at it from the economic perspective. And I think many of you have seen me show this slide many times, but historically, using the processes that we sort of built in our legal systems, our regulatory systems, and essentially the way we've approached business or approach the business of cleanup, what we end up with is oftentimes just escalating cost of cleanup without necessarily performance. And so what we've learned over the years is that if we take a better look and build a better conceptual site model up front, we can start to understand what options we have going forward. And we can start to monetize those options and maybe pick a more cost-effective and more successful result as we go forward and look at our efforts in cleanup. And so I think what I hope to do today is kind of show you some easy ways, really, not fairly simple ways, but using some pretty slick science in order to figure out how to do that characterization better, how to do a better performance monitoring, and understand, are we really making progress, so that we don't sort of blindly go down the path of spending money on the strategy of hope, which is really not a strategy. So I'm gonna ask Dora to just kind of give us a quick overview of the 5 primary tools that Microbial offers. And Dora, so take it away.
Wonderful. And I think many of you on this webinar are familiar with the tools, but just to kind of make sure everybody's on the same page, one of the tools that we really use a lot here is called quantitative PCR. So used to, as we've talked about, you would culture organisms, try to grow them on a plate in the lab and count them, and only 1 to 10% of microorganisms are actually culturable on plates. So qPCR gives us the way to accurately identify these different organisms. So as you can see here, we have these little array slides where we can put a sample on and we can look at a multitude of different qPCR targets all at the same time. So if you can go to the next slide, John, we can look at both organisms and functional genes that are of importance, and we have several different arrays. And I think the big news that you guys are kind of hearing for the first time on this webinar today is, you know about the quantarray chlor for chlorinated solvent degradation and the quantarray petro that we use for petroleum degradation. But we're also in the final stages of development of quantarrays to look at natural source zone depletion. So we'll have a quantarray NSCD and a biogeochemical quantarray. So when we do initial site characterization, we can start to look at all of those different pathways and look at sulfur cycling or at nitrogen cycling in our environments. And it can provide a lot of context, like John's going to be talking about today, in our different site models, so that we can see what microorganisms correlate with these different layers in our monitoring well, or different in the source zone versus down gradient locations, how these microorganisms and pathways are changing. So if you can go to the next slide, John. Another tool that you guys have seen a lot over the years, if you have petroleum hydrocarbons that you're interested in proving degradation, we can use qPCR to look at the pathways and see if they're there. But we can also use stable isotope probing, where we put a heavy weighted carbon. So in the environment, 99% of our carbon is a carbon-12, 1% is a carbon-13. Both of these are stable, and the ratio of these changes in a very predictable fashion with biodegradation. So we can flip the ratio of what we'd see in nature and make a compound that's 99% benzene, carbon-13. Load that onto our biotrap samplers, put those in a monitoring well. We can look at the organisms that naturally colonize and utilize these compounds, so you can definitively prove that the benzene was being biodegraded during that current period in the monitoring well. So it can start to give you some real context to it. And we'll talk next about a tool called Compound Specific Isotope Analysis, and there's a great webinar that's on our microbe website that talks about the differences between these two. But the primary difference is we often use CSIA for looking at compounds that are not a carbon and energy source for microorganisms, so like our chlorinated solvents. And this is where we're looking at that natural fractionation pattern. So we can use it to prove biodegradation. If we can look across the site and look at understanding how a compound is biodegraded, we can also look at biotic and abiotic mechanisms depending on how that fractionation occurs. It can give us a lot of information for adaptive site management, so we can see how things are biodegrading, what areas are most effective, then we can adapt other areas to be enhanced, to get better degradation processes. And then most importantly, one of the things John and I were talking about yesterday, it's a great tool that you can use for source delineation. So if you have multiple sources, for instance, you have multiple manufacturers of TCE that could be contributing to the site, you can do collection across the site, do some environmental forensics to help you identify if it's likely one source or multiple sources that are contributing to the contamination that you're seeing in a particular area. Next slide. And so this is where you can see that. In order to do it, you want to look at two isotopes. Typically, we're going to look for chlorinated compounds at carbon and chlorine, and we can do these dual isotope plots. So as you can see here, it's kind of like a chess game. We know that the degradation pathway is going to move in a predictable fashion if we do this dual isotope plot. Well, if we see that that does not move in the pattern that we would have expected, then that gives us an indication that there might be multiple sources that are coming into play. So then we can do some additional analysis to be able to differentiate that. So if you have questions on that, we do have a couple presentations on our website that would dive in a little deeper, but I think this really complements nicely with some of the high resolution tools that John uses. Next slide, please, John. And then finally, many of you are familiar, we can do our analysis from groundwater samples or from soil samples, and then we have unique to Microbial Insights, the biotrap samplers that you see here. These are the tool that we would use in the stable isotope probing like you saw, or we can just put them in a monitoring well with no compounds loaded on them, and we can look at what microorganisms colonize on these beads that are composed of 25% powdered active, 25% Nomex, which is what a fire retardant suit's made from, and 75% powdered activated carbon. And then we can characterize the microbes that colonize on these traps using these different tools like qPCR, next generation sequencing, or that stable isotope probing to help us understand. The thing I like about this, if you're doing the high resolution site characterization, you could see different zones vertically in your monitoring well. You could put these biotraps at different locations in the monitoring well so you can see how the microbial community compares at those different vertical depths. So a great tool that kind of complements what John's talking about today. A lot of these are on our website, and there's videos. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, or there's a lot of videos that you can get more depth of information on. So I think that's all I have for now, John.
Hey, thanks, Dora. And great tools. So now the question is, where do you put them on your site? When would you use them, and where would you put them? So just a quick overview of the high resolution tools that are pretty commonly used in the industry today. Membrane interface probe has been with us for a few decades. It's essentially a VOC screening tool, and it does that by essentially taking the purgeon trap that we're used to in the lab, take a heated element surrounding a membrane that's down in the lead edge of the tooling, and essentially heat the soil water vapor mixture and volatilize the components and bring those components up that come across the membrane, bring them to the surface and run them past the gas chromatograph in a series of detectors. And that allows us to screen the VOCs literally foot by foot, inch by inch, all the way down in the borehole, integrate that with some geotechnical tools like the hydraulic profiling tool, electrical conductivity, and so we get a feeling of the soil structure, the soil permeability versus the VOCs as we go down in each borehole. So we'll show some examples of that in a minute. Typically configured with 3 detectors, a photoionization detector, which we're all familiar with. You can run different lamps in that for different compounds. a halogen specific detector, which is, as it says, very specific to our chlorine atoms that are out there, and an FID detector, flame ionization detector, and that really gives us the ability to differentiate between our ethenes, our ethanes, and our petroleum compounds versus our chlorinated VOCs. And so we get very distinct signatures on VOC occurrences as we push down through the formation. In the petroleum world, or the world of PAHs, a couple of different tools for essentially fluorescing those PAHs, which give off a unique signature based on the type and the structure of the PAH compound. That allows us to go in and map the actual existence of non-aqueous phase product in the pore spaces of the soil, again, inch by inch as we push that down through the borehole. And so we get a very distinct signature, a fluorescent signature like you see here on the right, where the actual source material resides and where it exists in sufficient concentrations there to give us a fluorescent signature. It's OIP is a newer tool to the LIF UVO system, which has been with us again for decades. This gives us an ability to look at those fluorescent signatures in a waveform and sort of take that apart in different wave intervals. And it gives us a picture of that signature as we push down in the different oxidation or degradation situations that are occurring. So Randy St. Germain presented this last week at the ADM conference, and you can see some nice differences in the signatures. So we come down on the fluorescence here, where we've got oxidation occurring shallow, and then we see our more weathered gasoline. We also see this big hole in the permeability right here. So essentially we've got a blockage or a lack of flow in this particular case. And we come down here in our estimated K, we'll talk more about that. So we've got a flow zone, a no flow zone, and a degradation zone. So you can see, thinking about the tools Dora just described, it would matter where you put them in that formation, and it would matter where your monitoring well is screened across, because you might get an answer from this lower zone, but we don't have any gasoline down here, but we have the weathering occurring up shallow. So accurate placement of your tools, your microbial tools, as well as your geochemical tools and your sampling tools, soil and water sampling, matters a lot to the resolution of what's going on down there. So that's the first hint of what we're talking about here. Cone penetrometer has been with us for, again, decades, and gives us a very detailed look and a different way of looking at the geotechnical characteristics and the permeability characteristics of our soils. So we get a feeling it consists of a multiple sets of sensors on there. You've got a tip resistance, which tells us when that tip is pushing hard, it's pushing against something, doesn't want to let it go down. Sleeve refriction, you're going to increase your sleeve refriction in more of a clay type of scenarios where it's trying to pull along the side of the probe. You do put a ratio of those together and you start to get a feeling for the behavior of the soil. Not that it is a clay or it is a sand, but it behaves like a clay and it behaves like a sand, meaning it's more porous or not porous. And we also actually measure the pore pressure of the hydraulics right outside the window there with a pore pressure detector. So this gives us a feeling and a reading and a measurement, and in many cases a calibrated measurement of what the soil is behaving like as we push down. And that also can guide or inform us of where you might have transmissive zones and where you might want to take, or you might have storage zones of your contaminants, and where you might want to take, place your microbial tools, or where you might not want to place your microbial tools. So sort of the new tool on the block is the hydraulic profiling tool. This gives us an ability to measure the resistance of those soil pores, again, inch by inch, centimeter by centimeter, as we push it down through the formation. Where we've had resistance, the pore spaces or the throats of those pores are blocked or sufficiently small that we can't push water into there. So we would get a peak in our pressure. If we can push water, we'll get a lower pressure in there. So where we have high pressure zones, we'll get a lot less permeability than where we have low pressure zones where we have more permeability. So you can see, again, if you're looking at dissolved phase transmission of the particular compounds of concern, or the potential for water to influence or interchange with the compound, you're looking for something that's more permeable. And so where we place the tools, we might think about, do we want to be in a permeable zone or do we want to be in a tighter, likely more concentrated source zone? And so that you see that here when we combine the membrane interface probe with its CVOC detectors, PID and XSD detectors with that HPT, and a lot of acronyms, and I apologize for that. So if we push down in our permeable zone, we see a strong response on a chlorinated ethenes here. But if we keep pushing and we get the higher pressures in here, we have 2 more instances of chlorinated ethenes, which are likely storage areas and likely the culprits in a lot of the back diffusion that we see in the industry. So thinking about that, where would your well be screened? Where would you take your soil sample? Where would you take your water sample? And where would you place your microbial tools to inform both your design of your remedial system as well as the performance of your remedial system? And you can see it matters a lot in that picture from a vertical uncertainty perspective. And so this sort of demonstrates that. I borrowed these from Fred Payne in the book Remediation Hydraulics. If we put a nice long screen in there, that tells us whether something hits the screen, although diluted that it may be, but it gives us a very diffused picture of what that formation looks like, a very diffused picture of what the soils look like and the permeability of those soils and the transmissivity of our compounds of concern, as well as the performance of our degrading microbes in there. If they can't get the nutrients and the oxygen that they need in order to perform because their soils are too tight, we're not going to be able to effectively act in our remediation processes. So you can see that different soils are going to give us a lot of variability as we move down through the formation. So again, this tends to inform thinking about where do we take the samples, where do we want to collate the water with the soils, where do we want to put the microbial tools if we're going to leave something in there, and equally important, over which strata are our monitoring wells screened. So if we put a biotrap in a monitoring well, is it really sensing or monitoring the section of the plume or the degradation that we really want it to monitor? So let's talk about just what seems like simple, but actually a fairly significant issue. We have over 60,000 aging UST sites in the United States alone. And if you take an average $300,000 per site, that gives us an $18 trillion problem or a challenge that we're looking at. And I used to think, well, we didn't need to think in trillions of dollars, but now you read the public press and we're throwing around numbers like 2 trillion here, 4 trillion here, 6 trillion here. So 18 kind of sounds like, well, that's in the order of magnitude that we're used to talking about, but fairly large problem, complicated by a number of issues. Most of these sites, many of these sites, but most of them are many decades old. They've had a number of remediation processes attempted and really failed, I'll use that term. We've learned from the recent research that those oils that are in the ground are mostly going to be mature, dissociated petroleums, and they're not really going to be something that we can recover. They're going to exist in small blobs, pockets in different types of soil structures, but they're going to be very disassociated. And so the days of old where we had a big release, you could go in, put a well in, start skimming that well or start pumping on that well and get product recovery, those days are kind of behind us with these mature sites. Over those decades, a lot of owners have changed hands. The ownership has changed hands. So we have a lot of questions about financial responsibility and the cost is there. So if you think about this from an industry standard or even a public policy standard, how do we come up with a sustainable resolution of this situation? Sustainability, again, being environmentally, economic, and social. And how do we resolve the dispute or disagreements between Station A and Station B? Again, thanks to great work out of Colorado State and others, API and whatnot, we've learned an awful lot about natural source zone depletion. And so I'm just going to go into this just a little bit so we all understand that little blob of petroleum that's out there in the backyard of the gas station isn't as simple as we thought it is. And we've been fairly effective, assisted by Mother Nature in cleaning up the vadose zones on these masses that are still out there, but there's still a significant amount of petroleum mass below the air-water interface in the saturated zone. And what we've learned is the concept of monitored natural attenuation, where we have the electron exchange happening in the groundwater in the saturated zone, doesn't really account for the amount of mass that's lost from these masses over time. And so much more, the recent work has really identified these vapor phase or natural source zone depletion components that are occurring. So we have the oxygen infiltrating into the site. We have the aerobic volatilization that's going on and degradation that's going on. So we get the volatiles coming up to the surface and we get the carbon dioxide coming up from the surface from the aerobic degradation. But then we have this anaerobic process going on also, which is producing our methane and creating essentially a methane blanket over this process, which actually dampens the infiltration of the oxygen. So understanding the dynamics of this situation is pretty critical to effectively moving it forward and understanding what kind of help we really need to give the processes in terms of nutrients, venting of these gases, washing out of these gases or whatever in order to move this process forward. It also tells us whether it's happening or not. So take a look at that in sort of a live picture. This came off a site we did last week. So we have our source zone of petroleum over here on one location. So that's an LIF-UVOS response. You see a nice, pretty good response there in the 10 to 12 foot range. And again, that's a mature gasoline response that we see out there. Adjacent, we run an MIHPT boring. And what do we see? Well, we see that same response here on the PID and the FID, PID in blue, FID in red. We also see a little bit additional mass, deeper, most likely a lower concentration than necessary to fluoresce, although we're a little bit deeper over here than we were on this. It's displayed on the LIF-UVO, so that's an uncertainty question. This again is in that high pressure zone that we see with the HPT pressure here. So this mass is stored. It's not going anywhere. And it may or may not be a place where you want to put one of your microbial tools, but it is if you want to get the geochemical understanding, are we in an aerobic or anaerobic condition here? Same thing for this lower area here. But if you come up and remembering the picture we just looked at with natural source zone depletion, what do you see? Well, we see some FID responses starting to happen, and that's that methanogenesis that we typically see on site. So we don't have, look at our PID to FID ratio here on the MIP. We have a higher PID than FID here, and we have pretty much correlation down here. But up here in this instance, at the 6 to 7 foot range, what do we see? We see an FID response as compared to the PID. So we're starting to pick up indications of that anaerobic degradation right there. Move on up the chimney, so to speak, and we see we again pick up our VOC concentrations, our PID returns, and we come up here and then we get a big kind of peak right up here. And notice that's right under a high pressure cap right in here. So we see this a lot on our mature UST sites. This is really like a headspace that we're looking at on our sites. So you think about that. All right, what are we seeing in terms of that natural source zone depletion? Well, we're seeing the source material over here. We're seeing the storage of that material in these two zones here. We've got anaerobic degradation going on here. We've got VOC volatilization here. So think back to Dora's tools. We've got biotraps. We got PCRs that we can put in there. And we could do the stable isotope probing, if we want to look at that, and really kind of take this site apart in terms of confirming what's going on, but we're also need to take a look at the geochemical conditions that are in there and whether or not we actually have degradation or we stall it out as we move across the plume. So if we think about that from the natural source zone depletion, a lot of the work that's been reported, that process that Mother Nature's doing on her own is coming out as cost effective, or in terms of rate of remediation, about in the median of what all the active systems that were used in the study to put this together. I think Tom Palaya put this together with Jacobs. So Mother Nature's halfway there if we can figure out how to accurately diagnose where she is in that process and then how to enhance that process going forward. We can move that along without a lot of expense. Let me go back one. I missed one there. I think I have another slide. And Dora was telling me in her database and the work that they're doing with Claire in I think it was Claire in Australia, of the 10,000 analyses or over 10,000 analyses they have in their database, 50% don't have the geochemical conditions to support further degradation. We find that same thing when we look across the petroleum plumes in these mature sites, that they've basically stalled out because of depletion. And so realigning that, the availability of nutrients, realigning the availability of just venting off that methane cloud and or getting some oxygenated fresh water in there will really move that process along. So you can see how we might use those technologies. Got to move past the slide. How you might use some of the tools we're talking about. You got quantarrays for petro. We've now, Dora's talking about the quantarrays for the natural source zone depletion. We can go in with the stable isotope probing to confirm that we've got the degradation going on, and we can look at the biogeochemical conditions. And so we really can take a look at a more diagnostic way of doing things before we go in there and do a lot of surgery. And I'm not sure if I got a slide in here, but just roughing out the cost of doing that cost of putting that diagnostic picture together, or both to set up the remediation process, but also do the performance monitoring of that, is typically less than half of what it takes to operate one of these active systems for a quarter. So the economic picture really says, well, let's monitor what's happening, how much mass we're removing, and do we have the conditions in order to go forward, rather than sitting and watching BTEX concentrations over a period of months and quarters and years. Take it into the world of more complicated sites. Superfund, here's a site that we supported, the Palermo Superfund site out in Olympia, Washington. The challenge here was, as we see in a number of these types of sites, the city of Tumwater supply wells in the supply field down here had elevated concentrations of TCE, and the flow path, general direction of groundwater flow path, and as you can see up in here, the bay comes down in this direction, but the flow path is generally to the northeast. There's quite a vertical elevation drop going into this neighborhood, and we had elevated concentrations in the neighborhoods. And it was postulated there are 3 potential sources of that TCE coming from a former active dry cleaner in this location, and a couple of DOT laboratories, the former one here and the existing one here. So we're really looking at a TCE problem over here in the supply wells. 3 possible intersecting groundwater plumes, we'll call it. Active remediation was conducted here at the dry cleaner, and that was thought to be cleaned up. So then the question is where is the TCE coming from? How does it get here? And really, who's responsible at this point in time for the cleanup? Just putting all the historical groundwater data there and then co-locating over the top of that the responses off the membrane interface probe operated in a low-level mode you see, well, we have our TCE plume over in this direction over here, but we go heavily towards PCE, tetrachloroethylene, as we go through past the dry cleaner, which is like not a surprise there. And then it drops, it takes a big drop over the cliff here, and then we end up with TCE back over in here. So Laura talked about the CSIA, and this gives us a couple of good options for tools here to try to take apart who are the contributing sources to our TCE endpoint over here in the well field. So you think about putting in a layer of CSIA samplers and across the three different plumes, and we can sort of take and use a sort of a lines of evidence perspective on taking this apart in transects. But then the challenge comes is, where is that mass moving? And so we've also learned in the last few years a good understanding of where the mass flux is in these vertical transects. And we know that 80 to 90% of the mass is moving through about 10 to 20% of that vertical transect. So if we're talking about this well field, the three different plumes as we head towards that, we were operating in the 90 to 120 foot range of depths out there. And so where in that large vertical expanse of a degree of uncertainty is that mass flux moving, and where would I put my quantarrays, and where would I take my CSI samples? And do I want to do it in my more source-oriented areas, closer to the sources? Do I want to do it in my high flow zones? Do I want to do it in my more storage zones? So again, you can see this is a transect across one of those areas, and you can see we've got a couple of different different indications of mass in the area. So we've got this shallow CVOCs up in here. We've got deep CVOCs down in here where it changes the signature. Notice again, we're looking at PID here more than the chlorinated detectors. This is the low-level MIP operation in distinct patterns for each foot. Here we have a more emphasis on the chlorinated side of the detectors versus the PID side. And here we have a combination, pretty much mirror image of each other. So, I don't have the HPT logs in here, but what you see is a nice sandy aquifer all the way down, but it's really differentiated with different zones, with different combinations of compounds that are occurring in those different zones. So placement of the arrays and the placement of the samples, again, matters significantly. And if you think about the uncertainty associated with 80 to 100 foot boreholes, it really, in order to get the bang for the buck and get the accurate picture of what's going on, we've got to place those arrays in the right place. You get all the way over here, and we're all PID over here. Well, so it's all something of an ethane-based compound. And then the other concept to think about, and I don't know that we have time to go very far into it today, but if you think about in terms of biodegradation, certain processes are very amenable to the biodegradation, and certain compounds are toxic or interrupt the process. So if you take something like a nice TCE and you want to degrade that and follow it through the normal degradation chain that we're all familiar with it, that works great until you, as Dora alluded to earlier, you introduce a competing substrate like sulfates, or you introduce something with an ethane like a TCA, or even poison it with something like a carbon tet. So understanding what compounds we're looking at, and then what natural substrates exist, or what competing substrates exist in our formation that we're looking at. And then again, this question of porosity or permeability, how much can we move the water to the degrading microbes? How much can we refresh the nutrients in the substrate to those microbes versus what's stored and tied up, and we're not going to be able to have much of an exchange of activity to support the activity. This is a combined log of MIHPT with a cone penetrometer log in one of our sites down in Latin America. And you can see here, again, we get the CPT log, which gives us these tight zones that we run into, and it gives, it's pretty consistent over here. And I think the best way to look at that is in the ratio diagram, so you can see what's happening here. But if we look at it from an MIHPT perspective, we've estimated the hydraulic conductivity, or K here. So here's our static water level down about 7 meters, and you can see we have very distinct individual heterogeneity associated with the flow. So this is really an indicator of the porosity of those soils. And you can see our pressure just peaked in a number of locations. And so we're not going to have transmission or exchange of contaminants. We're not going to have an exchange of fresh nutrients and water and oxygen with any sort of microbes that are there. And if we want to go in and do sampling, biotraps, pull materials, send it off for further analysis, it's going to matter a lot where we place that in this formation as we go down. If I blow that up and just look at that MIHPT log for a second, you can see that we pick up a response there where we've got a strong response on the XSD, and that's our chlorinated halogen specific detector, without a correlating response on the PID. And that's a pretty good indication of a toxic compound. We're looking at an ethane. In this case, it's primarily a chlorinated freon. That's going to be disruptive to our degradation chains. And so if we placed our samplers in a well in that location, or we went in and grabbed samples from that location, we're going to come up with one set of understanding of the site. We see that repeated down here at a deeper depth. This is 20 meters down, so we're 60 plus feet down in the formation. And again, we have an XSD response with an FID without any correlating PID response. So these are potential toxic zones. We won't know exactly what it is until we go in and sample it, but it would inform the placement of our microbial tools and or the samples we want to pull for microbial analysis. Here, we actually have our compound of concern. So we've got a PID, FID, and XSD response, and these are all very small, indicating a very low mass site and a very narrow strata of potential flow, or just below that potential flow that's happening down there. So thinking about the resolution of our sampling and our tool locations is pretty critical, and a screened well across all of this would give us a very diffused and potentially confusing picture. So again, understanding what's there really informs what tool to use at what depth and for what reason. And even down below, deeper, you see we have a different substrate or a different material with our PID, FID responses. So we're really looking at something that's more petroleum, hydrocarbon based down here. And you can see it's in a very tight zone. So we have stored petroleum-based compounds down here in the deeper sector. So again, this discussion is in pieces, but available from a number of different organizations. ITRC has a guideline out on advanced site characterization tools, and it's an web interactive guide. I encourage you to take a look at that. The microbial biological tools, that ITRC guidance has been out for quite a while, and it probably needs to be updated. And I know Dora's working on updates to the work at Claire and CRC around the globe as those things. But lots of good information out there, and I encourage you to take advantage of it. Lots on Dora's site, some on our website. And it really just, again, think back to that picture of the Earth that Bill Anders took back in 1968. How can we leverage what Mother Nature is built with and can do on our own in a low-cost way of really moving our sites forward without spending a lot of money? So to take away points, if we're going to remediate the site, there's a lot of pieces in that value chain, and it really starts with understanding the site well with an accurate site conceptual model. And that means understanding the chemical, the hydrological, the biochemical and really understanding what's going on down there before we just start throwing money at it and start getting what I call the brute force remediation. I think hopefully I've shown you that the resolution to take apart the heterogeneity of the soil, take apart the heterogeneity of the different compound distributions, the partitioning of different compounds at different depths, and the different phases, whether it be vapor or dissolved phased or stored mass phases, is pretty critical to that conceptual site model and very critical to the placement of your monitoring well screens, of your soil and groundwater samples, and these microbial biological tools. And then yet those tools will tell us whether things are working. They give us an ability to plan, understand what we have to do to the site to make it amenable to remediation. They give us an ability to monitor that remediation and really give us a metric for measuring the success of remediation that we really can put a dollar sign on. So I encourage you to think about that, and I will wrap it up there. Oops, with the final slide. So Dora, I'll just see if we have any questions. But thanks again for joining us today. And
Thank you, John.
My pleasure.
That was a wonderful presentation. We do have a couple questions. Again, if you have questions for John, if you can type them into the GoToWebinar software, we'll read those off now. So the first question that we have for you, John, is it says, if I understand correctly, the technology is based on injection or release of biomaterial from one well into certain depths and monitored from a different surveillance well, similar to gas flooding in the petroleum industry. Is that correct?
That's not my understanding. So what we were trying to do was introduce two separate technologies, but collaborative, if you want to say it, or synergistic. In other words, what we want to do is understand the soil, water, vapor continuum, the heterogeneity and the uncertainty of that in a vertical borehole. And then with that, in the next step, bring in these biological tools to either take those samples and send them to microbiological analysis, or place abilities to measure sources or to measure the degraders that exist naturally in the formation and whether we have the conditions to support remediation. So there's not an active recirculation or anything of that nature. These are two different diagnostic steps. It's kind of like going to your doctor and saying, I'm feeling pretty ill. And the doctor says, and where do you hurt? And you say, well, I've got a stomach, I've got, something in my abdomen is not feeling so well. So what the doctor's going to do is send you in for a CAT scan or maybe even a CT scan. And I guess that's the same thing. And get a look at what's in there and see if there's any blockages, see if there's any unusual conditions, any unusual masses or something of that sort. And he's also going to send you over to the lab, and they're going to pull blood samples, and they're going to do a number of geochemical or microbiological chemical tests of your blood system to understand what's there and what's not there. And so it's combining that information from the high resolution imagery of the physical conditions with the diagnostics of the blood that tell us what's in the bloodstream, what might be causing any conditions, and whether your body's reacting to those conditions or not. So it's a very similar analogy, hopefully.
That's great. Okay, I think this next question, John, may be one that I can answer. This says, will Quantaray NSCD be available for both petroleum and chlorinated sites? So on that one, this natural source zone depletion array that we're looking at is looking at that interaction that happens in the monitoring well between methanogens and methanotrophs and biosurfactant production to release those light NAPLs, so they're bioavailable to microorganisms, and you get degradation in that groundwater column. And so I think most of the research that I've seen has been kind of related to petroleum, but the thing here is this NSCD array would typically be paired with the petroleum quant array, because you're making these bioavailable, you can get some natural source zone depletion, but you probably also have these aerobic and anaerobic degradations of your LNAPL that are occurring. So you certainly could look at your methanogens and your methanotroph interactions on the chlorinated side as well. But I think primarily the design of the array is kind of focused on the petroleum end. All right, next question for you, John. Would this methodology be effective in an environment where sulfolin liquor or sulfur-bearing organic compounds are the contaminant of concern?
Well, that's one piece of information. Then the next piece of information, where did they come from and what are they associated with? What other compounds are present and what's the goal of what we're trying to do? So I'm going to sort of wave off the question because there's a lot more information that has to come from that. Sulfur compounds, in general, could have ionic conditions associated with them, and they may be detectable with some of the sensors here, but that becomes more of a geochemical question from our perspective, as well as then understanding what kind of degradation may be occurring and the indications of those degradations. So I don't know, Dora, if you have anything more on the microbial side that would be an indicator of cleanup of that type of compound.
Off the top of my head, I don't know anything specific. I mean, we can look at a lot of the sulfur cycling, so that might be a nice complement to see kind of the redox state, or that biogeochemical array might be a nice overview of the redox state, so that you could then look at the degradation capabilities, but we don't have anything specific for sulfur compounds.
That'd be a fun one to learn more about. If you want to send us an email and we get on there and kind of take a look at what we're trying to do, but haven't had that one before.
Yeah, that's great. All right, this one's for you, John. Can you comment in a general way on the benefits of your high resolution diagnostic methods on both overall time of remediation and the cost associated?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm just going to pick on the UST sites because there's a lot of data on UST sites. And so we just did a presentation last week in the Alabama conference talking about the traditional approach to a UST site. And so 10, 15 years of remediation of vacuum extraction followed by in situ chemical oxidation, 10, 15 years, $500,000. No change in BTEX concentrations. Decision was made, well, let's find out what's going on down there. We went and looked at the high resolution picture and really more completely delineated the mass, found it much further up gradient, we'll use that term loosely, than it should have been, much deeper than it should have been, and about 5 times larger in terms of total mass than was originally calculated for the chemox. So that was, following that, they shifted to an enhanced biodegradation process, and that one particularly are using Foster to do that. So we're 18 months into that process. 18 months versus 18 years, and the team have knocked down concentrations. 2 or 3 of the wells are down below the site-specific test limits, and we're about $270,000 into the problem with both the HRSC followed by the Foster injection over 18 months. So for half the price, in 18 months, they've achieved what hadn't been done in 15 years. And I think that story, no matter what method we use to do the remediation, understanding whether the site has the biogeochemical conditions to move forward is really the critical missing step after you figure out where the mass is. But most of the time we find the mass delineation has been incomplete because of older methodologies, and in my opinion, an overabundant reliance on groundwater, which is not where the mass is. It's only an indirect indicator. So that's a bona fide quantifiable number, 500 grand versus 270, 18 years versus 18 months on a simple kind of site.
All right, that's great. I think this next question is for me, John, but I would be curious to hear about your experience with this as well. The question is, have you considered using the flute liners in combination with your in situ biotrap technologies to get mini discrete depth interval for initial data review and MLS installation, similar to modern approaches to temporary transducer deployments? So we've used the flute liners quite a few years ago in a government site. So if those are being used, we can definitely deploy the biotraps in between it. The only thing that you have to be careful about is you have to have some way to link that trap to the top. So making sure that there's not any interruption in sectioning off a portion of that monitoring well through the discrete sampling, because you need to leave them for a period of 30 to 60 days. So you're going to have a line going to the surface. So just making sure you take that into account is the biggest kind of lesson that we learned from that. But one thing that we can do and that we routinely do is when we do like in situ microcosm studies with our biotrap samplers, we can put different amendments in there. And so in order to put multiple amendments in a monitoring well, we want to be able to section off portions of that well. So what we do in those cases is we'll put baffles on each end of the biotrap that are similar to the size of the casing of the monitoring well. So then we can divide off, because it kind of interrupts that circular flow that happens in a monitoring well. So we can put baffles in there as an option to be able to get discrete interval sampling. And I think that would pair really well with the high resolution characterization that you get from John's technology. So if you have anything to add to that, John.
Yeah, I would add that, again, the tools that I described were really more of an interactive, let's figure out what's there, what's the situation now kind of thing. And then I think, as you described, Dora, I would much rather leave a well-designed, instrumented flute liner in the formation to monitor the performance of my degradation than I would like to leave a screen monitoring well in there. Because I think the monitoring well is just confusing the issue, and it's an indirect measurement of what's going on. So if I had a well-instrumented flute liner that was my performance monitoring point or points, I think that would be good. We don't employ a lot of flutes during the initial investigation because it's very interactive in terms of depth and movement. So flute is really more of a sort of a semi-permanent instrument and protection of that borehole once it's been performed. I like the idea, though.
Yeah, me too. So if you have questions on that, again, that's something that we could definitely take a look at if you think it would be helpful at your site in assessment. And John and I could work together to help you create a plan with the tools for that. This next one is for you, John. Is there any limitation to the pollutant type that can be detected by the UVOST?
Yes. So any of the fluorescence tool, UVOS, OIP, a couple of other tools, they're only responding to essentially fused benzene rings, or those that exist in the PAHs. They will also respond to some natural fluorescent material, so that provides a little bit of a, you need to take that into account, and depending on the type of the geology of the site that you're working, or the mineralogy of the site that you're working at. So essentially, you have to look at a petroleum compound, anywhere from a distillate all the way back down to the crudes, and understand, well, what is the preponderance of PAHs in the compounds I'm looking at? And you can think about it, if we've distilled out gasoline, it has much fewer PAHs in it than a diesel, or moving on down to something heavier. And so understanding that the original composition of your fuel is important, but also understanding the composition of your fuel after days, weeks, months, years of degradation, you're going to get a different signature. So the fluorescence tools are going to energize those PAHs and they're going to give off a light frequency and decay rate that's unique to that PAH structure. So they don't respond to B-tex compounds. They don't respond to things that don't have those double bonded or those fused benzene rings in them. And it only responds to the actual mass in the pore space. So you've got to have a true NAPL there to pick it up.
Great. So the next question, John, is can we use the PID-FID response to come up with a dispersion model of the pollutant?
Oh, great question. Let's try it. I'd like to learn more about that. But in a given borehole with a given run on the MIP, those detector ratios are informative. So I think that there's some potential there. It's not quantitative, but it's informative.
Would PFAS show up on your FID detector?
Oh, wouldn't we love that? I think Dora and I both have no answer to the PFAS question, other than hydraulics associated with it, which might point to where you might want to look for something that's permeable, transmissive of the PFAS, the fluorinated compounds.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John. There's one last question that asks if the recording is going to be available for a late joiner. And yes, this will be on the MI website by the end of this week. So you can go on to the webinar section under the resources of the MI website and be able to listen to the wonderful webinar that John gave today. John, I can't thank you enough for participating and doing this webinar for us. It was definitely a great learning experience for me. I always enjoy working with you, and we're getting a lot of comments about what a great presentation you gave. So we're grateful for you sharing your expertise and your technology with us today.
Hey, my pleasure. I love the relationship. Thank you.
All right, and thank you everyone for taking time to join us. Again, you'll get an email that will give you a link to the recording so you can listen. And if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'm sure John would be happy to take any questions that you have, or you can email us at info@microbe.com. And we would be happy to get those to John and get answers for you. So thank you everyone for your attendance today. We really appreciate it. Thank you, John.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Bye.